The movie starts with Greg explaining about the good times and bad times in everybody's lives. The good times can be like eating amazing free Vietnamese food with a hot girl playing the harp. Whereas, the bad times can be like being around a crocodile in acid water. He indistinctly starts typing on his computer talking about his senior year. The school bus arrives at the school, and Greg begins to narrate the story of his Shenley High School. He briefs the audience on all the intense studies he does at his school. His friend asks him about his summer and Greg thinks that it is good to have citizenship of multiple nations. He believes in maintaining relations with everyone but keeping it beneficial. He further expresses hate towards the cafeteria as he views it as a disputed territory of multiple nations like the Gaza Strip, Indians, the Philippines, and many more. Greg has always eaten in the room of his history teacher Mr. McCarthy with his friend Earl. He then gives his point of view on hot girls destroying life even if they are good. He explains that hot girls are just like the moose who stomp the heads of innocent chipmunks. Soon after, Madison enters Mr. McCarthy's office because she's looking for him. Greg and Earl redirect her to room 309 where their teacher is right now. Now Greg is at home watching porn on his computer. But his parents enter the room all of a sudden and his mother starts going through his stuff. She orders him to be serious about his future and lists down all the places he could go to college. Greg strictly refuses to go to Princeton and then asks them to end this conversation once and for all. But his mother has something else important on her mind that she needs to discuss too. She breaks the news to Greg that her friend's daughter Rachel has recently been diagnosed with leukemia. The news makes Greg feel very sorry for Rachel. His mother urges him to make Rachel happy and call her. Greg sarcastically answers back because he's not sure why he should call. And even if he does, what would he even say? He dreads the awkward conversation of being the friend who used to care about Rachel but now feels bad for her. His mother guides Greg to just make a small nice gesture for her when she is sick. He agrees to call but requests them one last time not to go through his stuff again. He calls Rachel and starts the conversation by making it fun. He jokes that the doctor has prescribed her a dose of Greg, which is why he called. Rachel immediately understands that he knows about her diagnosis and demands to know the purpose of this call. He makes up an excuse to meet, but Rachel refuses him. So, he gives up and ends the conversation. But his mother pushes him more to go to Rachel because she needs a friend at this time. She teaches Greg that he has an opportunity to do something good for someone and he's foregoing it by choosing to stay at home. The scene shifts when Greg goes to meet Rachel but runs into her mom Denise first. She hugs Greg and expresses her gratitude to him by complimenting how good, kind, and handsome he is. When Greg doesn't agree with all these compliments, Denise adds modesty to the list too. Then, Denise calls out to Rachel, who has been sitting on the staircase upstairs. She seems annoyed and wants to know why he came. Greg repeats his failed joke and invites her to hang out with him. But Rachel is aware that he is pitying her and refuses to hang out with him. Greg loses his patience and spills out that he is only here because his mom is forcing him and she is annoying him continuously. He asks a favor from Rachel to just spend one day with him so that his mom can be satisfied. They go to Rachel's room where Greg starts to observe his surroundings. He notices that she has many pillows and expresses his envy of her collection. Rachel suggests just asking his parents for more pillows. Greg smirks and responds that he can't do this because his parents will be suspicious of him masturbating with pillows in his room. He then cracks a joke about the pillow and boy relations to make Rachel laugh. Their conversation is interrupted by a text from his friend Earl, so he takes his leave from Rachel. Rachel is curious about who Earl is. Earl is Greg's best friend whom he has known since kindergarten. Greg and Earl bonded over their similar tastes for classics of foreign cinemas to such an extent that they started making their stupid titles and stories. They have made 42 movies till now. Earl asks Greg if he is going to meet that girl again. Greg says yes, and then Earl jokes that it is his last chance to get some action. When Greg's class ends, he asks his teacher about leukemia, innovatively informing his class about Rachel's sickness. He then visits her and tells her about his mistake. Rachel hates talking about her sickness and receiving pity from people. Greg advises her to be annoying, be distant from everyone, or to be subhuman like Gandhi, who got a separate territory. Rachel doesn't agree with the notion of Gandhi being subhuman, but by this time Greg has found another thing to do. He tells Rachel to lie down and pretend to be lifeless, until he realizes how rude and inappropriate that is, especially when she has a chronic illness. He quickly apologizes to Rachel and admits that he is weird. He is rambling on in guilt when Rachel actually follows the suggestion, making the situation less tense. Their friendship starts to bloom and they start hanging out with each other more regularly. They start eating together in each other's house. She speaks about how bad she feels for her to go through all this and see her daughter sick. Her mother is alone. She has no friends and relatives, and Rachel doesn't know what she is going to do once she's gone. She then tells him that she has zero connection and bond with her dad, to which Greg advised her to apply for a refund for another dad. They enter a library where she asks Greg to guess which group she belongs to in her senior school. Greg says boring senior girls and laughs and asks her to appreciate his honesty. Rachel calls him an asshole. He also shares that his senior year was just surviving. Rachel invites Greg to sit with his boring senior girls group in the cafeteria. To remove the awkwardness, he mocks Scott Mayhew's walk, which is equally mean and funny. However, Greg panics when he realizes that Scott Mayhew heard that. To save himself, he returns to his friend Earl in the history teacher's room. Mr. McCarthy forbids them from eating cookies there because Earl won them from drug dealers. He then goes on to enjoy his Vietnamese soup and refuses to share it with them, after which he eventually exits. Greg now realizes that he has kept a low profile for 8 years and it is being ruined by his interaction with Rachel. He did not mean to say that and agrees that he is a jerk. But it's also true that their interaction brings no good for him. He puts his thoughts aside as he and Earl try the Vietnamese soup. Greg is in class when he starts feeling weird and sees hallucinations. Soon after, he receives Earl's message that the soup they ate a while ago had. Both of them experience strange sensations as they have consumed weed. Greg has to meet Rachel in some time and asks Earl to join him. On their way back home on the school bus, Greg accidentally screams out and exposes Mr. McCarthy for adding his soup. Scott Mayhew is sitting in the backseat and overhears this. Meanwhile, Greg and Earl make it to Rachel's house and say hi to her mom. They both enter Rachel's room while still being high. Greg insensitively questions Rachel about how she feels after chemotherapy, which sucks. Earl interrupts to soften the blow because Rachel has no other option but to get the chemo. Rachel gets offended and commands them to leave if they continue to talk this way. This leads them to confess that they accidentally got, which is why they are behaving so senselessly. To cater to Rachel's curiosity, Greg comes up with a whole elaborate story of how they were just tasting Mr. McCarthy's regular soup and went to buy some more from the office building. But then they got trapped in the elevator of the Jamaican embassy with the Rastafarian guy, because of whom they had to breathe the weird marijuana air. After this idiotic ruse, they say sorry to Rachel. Earl reminds Greg that this isn't why they came here in the first place. He gives the brilliant idea of getting ice cream for everyone. Earl remembers Rachel as she once acted heroically when she shut down the pervert who was showing marks on his butt to girls. Rachel questions the nature of Earl and Greg's friendship, which leads to Earl spilling information about Greg having serious issues. He adds that Greg is brainwashed by his mom to believe that he's handsome. His dad doesn't socialize and he is scared that if he makes friends, they'll all leave one day, so he keeps to himself. The reason why Greg is different from Earl is because they made 42 films together, but they all suck. Earl shows her the movies they made, after which she instructs him to look out for his stoned friend, and she leaves. Scott Mayhew spreads the news of Greg claiming that there was marijuana in Mr. McCarthy's soup. Mr. McCarthy verifies this from Greg, who confesses to his mess. He explains the state he and Earl got in after they had the soup. It was the only thing he and Earl tried, along with the cookies Earl got from the dealer. It is when he's uttering these sentences that he gets enlightened on the error in his judgment. Of course, it was the cookies from the dealer that made them high. Yet, Scott Mayhew remains on a mission to obliterate Greg and his friends' lives. Rachel tears up in front of Greg as she no longer likes herself. She never considered herself beautiful, but now she looks different after losing all her hair. Whenever someone meets her, they feel repulsed by her condition. Greg assures her that she looks beautiful as always, which somehow makes her even more angry. She argues that she looks ugly and everyone is lying to her to protect her feelings. She expresses her frustration at how everyone's attempts to make her happy upset her even more. He gives her a movie called Mono Rash to improve her mood. The plot of this movie involves Earl killing everyone because he has a rash. Greg has to leave now because he and Earl are working on another movie about the unspeakable brutality of war, and finding a box of tulips, which in the middle of it, Greg asks if he should stay with her, but she lets him go so he can make his movie. Earl and Greg are making tulips for their movie when Madison arrives. They are confused about how she found them and learn that Rachel gave up their location to her. Madison gives them the idea of making a movie for Rachel as a special gift that she will love. Greg agrees to this but doesn't decide on a specific time to start shooting. This is because they have a whole collection of their movies to keep Rachel entertained for a long time. Later, Greg meets up with Rachel in a cafe and admits that he doesn't want to go to college. Rachel guides him to think properly, as college will be great. He can choose to keep a low profile there. She explains to him that he might hate himself in the future for not going to college and assures him that he'll find his people there. She directs him to send out an early application for Pittsburgh State. She even emotionally blackmails him into applying by reminding him that she has stage 4 cancer. He starts writing his application with why he hates going to his senior high school, how high school bites and chews you like a demon, and how it is overwhelming. Then he writes in seriousness that he is looking for a college that's accepting. This is because he did not fit in his senior high school because of his weird face and behavior. Rachel snatches his laptop from him and starts writing about him honestly and professionally. She materializes how his self-image issues and how college will help with that. Greg finds this essay very personal when Rachel reminds him that's the whole point of a personal statement, Greg tries to return the favor by handing her a guidebook to find herself a good college. The sadness that creeps up in her eyes shows that Rachel knows that she probably won't live long enough to make it to college. As always, she evades her feelings by pressuring him to continue his movie. He starts spending almost every day with her while watching the movies he and Earl made together. He even stays with her in the hospital, and she falls asleep once while he watches over her. That's when Greg receives a message from Pittsburgh State College that he has been accepted. Greg feels almost bad because he has now begun to feel something for Rachel. He covers Rachel with a blanket, after which he walks out of the room. Greg meets up with Earl and enlists his help to make a movie for Rachel because he remembers his commitment now. However, they lack some fresh inspiration and have no idea what they will be working on for this movie. Greg brings himself to ask Denise for an interview to find out what Rachel's birth was like and what her favorite toy was. Denise recalls that Rachel's birth was really special for her, and she always tried to protect her from growing up too fast as a single mom. She also advises the boys to only have kids with a girl they actually love, which reflects on her regrets. Furthermore, she mentions Rachel's favorite toy, which were scissors that she used to snip all the books when his dad left her. Then, Greg interviews her friends who just motivated, pitied, or gave some encouragement for Rachel. But he doesn't get anything interesting and new out of them. As time passes, Rachel becomes quieter and unhappier than before, which causes Greg to check up on her. Rachel expresses that she remembers their first death conversation and now she can relate to it. Greg regrets his behavior and apologizes to her in his own way by making bear sounds to make her laugh. A message interrupts the movie to assure the audience that Rachel is going to get better, so they better stay with the story. Greg's whole summer vacation is spent making his special, but silly project, and spending time with Rachel. Sometimes, Rachel would talk a lot, and other times she would just stay quiet. When she isn't in the mood to talk, Greg takes charge of keeping the conversation going. They'd also watch movies which sometimes used to crack her up, and other times she remained grim. Rachel has become the center of his life at this point. One day she asks him about what's going on at school. Greg reports that medieval prom is approaching and everyone is practicing their twerking skills for that. Greg, however, isn't going because he doesn't have a date and resembles a dog wearing a tux. He proposes that she could go, but she immediately turns this thought down. Rachel checks up on the progress of the movie they were making for her, and Greg gets angry at Earl for ruining the surprise. Rachel confides in him about considering the option of stopping her treatment, as it only makes her more sick than making her feel better. Greg strongly disapproves of this option and warns her that it might lead to her early demise. Rachel lightens the conversation by joking that he should take his pillow to prom. This doesn't work, as Greg lashes out at her in frustration and concern. Rachel retaliates by snapping back because she feels sicker, uglier, and weaker every day she stays in bed. Greg's anger elevates because he doesn't want his friend to perish. Rachel is at the lowest point right now and finds the idea of her passing fine, because then, at least Greg can go back to his old self. Greg questions if she'd be okay with Denise watching her die slowly, and even hearing this is unacceptable for Rachel. She calls out Greg for only doing all these things for him because he was compelled by others to do so. He hung out with her because of his mom, showed her his movies because of Earl, and is making her a movie because of Madison. But there's one thing that he can do for her, which is to get out of her life and never find his way back to this sick girl. Greg takes out all his anger from this fight on Earl, who betrayed his trust by leaking their conversation to Rachel. He can no longer trust Earl and blames him for his falling out with the girl. Earl, in turn, admonishes Greg's inability to care and sympathize for anyone but himself. He makes Greg realize that no one cares about him and the only one who cares about him is Rachel. He yells at Greg for constantly whining about the film and acting as if Rachel is some burden. Amid their argument, Greg dares Earl to punch him and he complies. In the next scene, he asks Mr. McCarthy if he can have more time to finish his schoolwork. Mr. McCarthy asks about Rachel's condition and teaches him the example of his father, who became good later in life. Greg doesn't even let him finish and storms off. Back at his house, his father informs him that Earl came by and strangely left some sausages for him. He goes to his room and finds a USB that contains Earl's sincere message for Rachel to be added to the movie. For his part, Earl appreciates Rachel for not being the stupid white girl. He calls her brave and patient for dealing with this illness the way she does. He could have never managed to be so calm if he were in her place. Greg goes into Mr. McCarthy's office for lunch, where he also finds Earl. They don't make up and Madison approaches Greg to get an update on Rachel's movie. Greg starts coming up with excuses and brings up Rachel's decision to give up on her treatment. Madison is hurt to hear and reasons to Greg that this is one more reason he should speed up working on his movie. Greg's mom tries to patch things up between Greg and Rachel, but they both stay stubborn. Greg is warned that he'd later regret this decision, and this causes him to lash out. He antagonizes his mom, claiming that his life is already full of regrets as he has no date for prom, no friends, no one to make movies with, and losing his admission because he missed out on schoolwork. Now, Greg's parents are really worried about his future. During lunch break, Madison approaches him in the cafeteria and touches his shoulder. Greg shoves her off and is in no mood to talk. As he's packing his lunch to go away, one of his classmates publicly bullies him. The whole school gathers to watch the fight, but Earl jumps in to fight for Greg. As a result, the three boys get suspended from their school. Madison invites Greg to be her prom date, and he accepts because she's been his childhood crush all along. As Greg gets ready for his prom, he thanks his mother for the tux and they hug. But she's still upset about his college admission and plans to have a talk with him later. She gives him the corsage to go to the prom, unaware that he'll change his mind later. At the last moment, Greg decides to go to the hospital instead of the prom. On his way, the limousine driver asks if he loves the girl he is going to see. This puts Greg into deep thought. Denise hugs him when he arrives at the hospital and he shows off his outfit. He brings his iPhone and a portable projector and places a corsage around Rachel's wrist before running the film he made for her on the front wall of her room. He admits that the only reason that he could not show it before was because the movie sucks, and it still sucks. Rachel is moved to tears by the film by the time it finishes. Rachel's condition gets worse and Greg calls Denise, the doctor, and the nurses. He starts crying and sits on the floor as Rachel gets surrounded by the medical staff. He is later told that Rachel has fallen into a coma. 10 hours later, Rachel perishes. This is when Greg admits to the viewer that he lied about Rachel not passing, as he didn't think she would. Fast forward to Rachel's funeral. Greg and Earl find their way back to each other. Denise hands him a book and Greg climbs into Rachel's empty room through a window. There, he finds a letter on her bed that she left behind for him. Reading it reveals to him that Rachel knew about the messes created in his life due to her presence. Therefore, she reached out to his college herself and did the one thing she hated the most, talking about her illness. She attempted to convince his college to take him back because all the setbacks he faced in his studies were due to him devoting his time to her. There's a copy of the letter she wrote to the college attached. It also has Rachel's humorous claim that if this works out, then this means that she can help him even from her grave. The letter ends with Rachel bidding her farewell and one last warning that he'd be an idiot not to go to college. She also leaves behind her pillow collection to him because they'll be loved at his house, hopefully not in the disgusting way he joked about earlier. When Greg finally opens the book Denise gave him, it features a carving of 3 characters that Rachel made: herself, Greg, and Earl. The book also has more scenes of the time that the trio spent together throughout Rachel's life. He takes one last glance at the pink wig that Rachel used to wear before leaving her room with the pillows. Talking with Rachel's Anne enlightens him on how she wanted to be a squirrel, which is why her ashes were released in the park. He remembers this is why the wallpaper in her room had squirrels on it. Now he understands Mr. McCarthy's lesson of how you can learn a lot about a person even after they perish. Greg safely secures Rachel, the film, in an envelope with a warning note attached. The note on it says, "Watch at your own risk." The last person who watched this movie went into a coma and perished.